All right, welcome to the third presentation in our spring webinar series for the Wisconsin Citizen Lake Monitoring Network. This is Paul Skowinski. I'm the statewide educator for the Citizen Lake Monitoring Network. A couple of reminders before we hand it over to Shelli today. All of our webinars are recorded for later viewing, so you will be able to find a recording of today's webinar on our UW Extension Lakes YouTube channel. So if you search UWEX Lakes, that is the name of our channel. And I'll have a link out to the recording today or tomorrow. The other announcement is just to remind everyone to put questions into the chat box. So Shelli and I can both monitor that. Shelli, I'll take care of it, but you're welcome to look at the questions as they come in. And it'll just be up to Shelli's discretion whether she'd like to address a question right away, if it's pertinent to a particular slide, or hold them to the end. Totally up to you, Shelli. I will turn over my slides to Shelli once we get going here. Forgot to advance there. A reminder for next week's webinar on Wednesday, we'll have Katie Belfus from the Wisconsin Wetlands Association talking about wetlands in Wisconsin, their values and threats to them and things like that. And now I will turn it over to Shelli to share her screen to talk about mammals around Wisconsin lakes.
Okay, I just wanted to say hi, introduce myself real quick. I have been here at UW-Stevens Point since 2005, so a lot longer than I care to admit, but I have the best job in the world. I thoroughly love interacting with undergraduates and my colleagues like Paul, other wildlife faculty and the other faculty in the College of Natural Resources. Was it just last week, Paul, that Marie gave her webinar?
Yes.
Marie Perkins is a close colleague of mine in wildlife. So we're just really happy that we could prepare these. We're getting a heck of a lot better at Zoom than we ever wanted to be because of COVID. So I am going to now share my host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, there we go.
I'll take care of that just a second here.
Okay.
All right, you should be good.
All right, let's see here. So I am going to try to be kind of multimedia. I've got a couple of other sites open on the internet because I really want to focus today on a couple of aspects of wetland wildlife, wetland mammals mostly, that we'll talk about. But I'd like to really talk about their management in the state and how the state game agencies in our state, Wisconsin DNR, manages each of these creatures. But I also want to talk a little bit about a research project that we did on short-tailed weasels, also known as ermine or stoats. So I study wildlife health. I study wildlife diseases. It's not always the sexiest aspect of wildlife management, like animal behavior or something like that. But that's my background, is mostly in wildlife diseases. And so we were looking at some parasites of short-tailed weasels, and it was all undergraduate driven. So I want to talk a little bit about that project. So we'll get started. The first thing I want to focus on is just that a lot of the animals that we're going to talk about here, river otters, mink, weasels, raccoons, they're harvested for their fur. So they are valuable not only because we like seeing them. I mean, I'm a big fan of the weasel family. I kind of like the underdogs, a little bit of a, kind of a bad attitude in general, the Mustelids have. So I'm really fond of the weasels in general. But not only are they valuable because we like to see them and for their ecosystem and ecological benefits, but we also harvest them for their fur. And that is one of the ways that we can focus on the importance of these critters, right? It's really hard to assign value to something if you don't have some kind of monetary benefit from it. It's hard to quantify or calculate the amount of money that somebody would pay to see something in comparison to the amount of money somebody would pay to have the opportunity to harvest that critter. So I'm going to focus a little bit on fur. And so we've got guard hairs that are the the kind of longer hairs that overlay and protect the fur. So in many cases, the guard hairs are the really long ones that come out of the pelt, but there's also the relatively short hairs that don't grow indefinitely. They grow to a certain length and then they stop growing, and that's the underfur. If we think about something like a beaver, if I was in front of you in person, I would be passing around a beaver's skin for you to feel, because it's a really diagnostic for both of that guard hairs and underfur. It's a lot of these animals that we're going to talk about today have a partially aquatic lifestyle, or in many cases, highly aquatic lifestyle. And that, because that water is cold, they need to be able to protect thermal regulation and be able to stay warm. And so these guard hairs and underfur are ways for these animals to do that. They're not like marine mammals that get a really big, thick blubber layer, right? They put on a lot of fur. And so when they're harvested, they're usually put into the market, and so those trappers can get money for their pelts. And they'll harvest them midwinter when the fur is at its prime. So the trapping season for some fur bearers might start in October and go all the way through December and January. But a lot of those trappers are not going to be out doing as much trapping in October as they might do later in the year, primarily because the fur gets to be more prime later in the trapping season. So guard hairs are at their maximum length and the underfur is at its maximum thickness, which then will fetch a greater amount of money in the market. So I'm going to start with northern river otters, and I'd like, if we were in person, I would say, hey, how many of you guys around these lakes have seen northern river otters? And I may ask for a little bit of that via the chat. This is a species that has not always been hyper abundant in the state. We see a lot more of them now. We had a grad student who just graduated earlier this year, and she was studying northern river otters and putting trail cameras out in the northern part of Wisconsin and getting a lot of photographs of these otters and a lot of signs. She looked for scat, she would look for slides in the winter. And so they eat a lot of critters that are found really in close proximity to the lakes and the wetlands that you guys monitor. So fish, amphibians, turtles, crayfish, and they're one of the rare social species that we're going to talk about. Beavers are pretty social, but river otters are very social. And so when you see a group of them, if you see them in snow, it just looks like they've been having a party over there. You know, there's all these tracks and they're playing, they're very playful, they're sliding. They're very entertaining to see. They're dark brown on the top and lighter on the bottom. And this is their geographic range here. It's kind of disjunct. There's some parts of the central continent here that are not where river otters are not very common. Because of that, there have been a lot of restoration efforts around many states. It was used to be state endangered in Indiana. It was removed in 2005, but they've also been having some reintroduction efforts, like Louisiana would donate, if you will, or give some otters to some of the Midwestern states. They're very sensitive to pollutants, especially mercury. Part of it is because their diet, like things like frogs as an example, they can accumulate these pollutants in their tissues. You know, something like a frog as a tadpole is acquiring all of these chemicals potentially from the soil and from the water, and then it's starting to get amplified. And so these guys are pretty good at taking down some frogs, and so they're pretty sensitive to pollutants. They're not as sensitive to PCB pollutants as mink are, primarily because their diets are a little different. So northern river otters have a little bit more diverse diet, and the fish that they eat are a little smaller in size when compared to some of the fish that a mink might take down. So they are a fur bearer. Now I'm going to try to be multimedia. We'll see how well this works, but look at that. So I want to just share with you some information about otter harvest. So Brian Dewey and Sean Rossler are kind of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources statisticians, and they produce these extremely informative, in my opinion, harvest and fur bearer reports every year. And so the one that's easily available right now is the 2019 report. And I just want to show you at the bottom here how many permits are issued, and then the state harvest. So the state harvest goal is for the last several years has been about 2,000 otters. They also have a very active research program going on where if somebody from the public harvests an otter tooth for aging, and then look at males versus females and look at if the females were pregnant, because you can look inside the uterus of the carcass and identify if there's what's called placental scars on that. So everywhere on the uterus where a placenta has attached for a kit, you'll have remnants of that. So they can say, okay, this female otter was pregnant last year and she had two kits.
Hey, Shelli, are you trying to share something other than your PowerPoint right now?
Oh, I am.
We're just seeing your PowerPoint slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I gotcha. So now I need to do this. Yep, thank you for letting me know. Now can you see?
There it is, yep.
Oh, sorry guys. Okay, so this is the otter harvest report. So, all right, I'll remember to do that next time, Paul. Thank you so much. So this is the 2018, 2019. These are the super statisticians I was just talking about. And so here's the otter harvest goals and the permits issued. So there's like 12,000 permits, but they generally will only harvest 2,000, but way fewer than that is usually harvested. So this to me is really informative from 1970s all the way to 2018 and 2019. This is the total registered harvest, even though the goal is about 2,000. Last year, or 2018, 2019, about 1,500 animals were harvested, and then here's the average price per pelt. And you see it's really quite variable. In some years it's like $85, and some years it's $25. So there's also, I can figure out how to move this around. Now I will share this. Okay, so now can you see the otter population analyses?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, right on. So so Nathan Roberts is the fur bearer biologist for the DNR, and he will come up with what he thinks the population estimate is for otters. And so this is like age, structure, and reproductive rates. These are the kinds of things that they collect from the carcasses. So carcasses were obtained from about 1,000 otters. And essentially, then they also fly and look for do an aerial survey. And what I wanted to show you is how they came up with that 12,000, how do we know that there's 12,000 otters in here, right, in the state? Well, they look at transects surveyed, looking at track counts, and then they look at stream and river crossings, and then the number of those crossings that had otter tracks. And so over time, you can see populations kind of are fluctuating. This is from aerial surveys, but they also look at the number of animals that were harvested the previous year. So here's how they take all of those data and come up with what they think is their pre-harvest population estimate. So there's a lot of science that goes into this, and I just find it kind of fascinating. I'm a little geeky that way too, but I just wanted you guys to understand that it's not like kind of a guess. I mean, they do come up with the way the number that they should be harvested based upon some mathematical models, and then they share those with the public. So let's see if we have anything in the chat. What determines the price of a skin? That's a good question. It's a market kind of system. So there's a amount in the market, and then if the market is flooded with a lot of otters, then the price might go down. And if there's fewer otters in the market, fewer pelts out there, then the price might go up. But it's also based upon the quality of the pelts from that year, as I understand it. And I'm certainly not a fur bearer pelt expert, but that's as I understand it. That's the way that those things are determined. Oopsie. So the next species we're going to talk about is the American mink. Again, like I said, I have a lot of affection for the mustelids. These guys are a little different. They're smaller bodied, all right, than the river otters, or can be quite large. But the minks that I have seen, or in the pelts that we have on campus, they have some kind of white blotching either on the chin or on the chest. Besides that, they're pretty uniformly brown in color. I just had a student last week who sent me a video of a mink that he saw swimming around his house. And you could still see that it had this like a little bit of white on its chin. They can occur all the way up into Alaska and into the eastern United States, not as common in the West. They have been also introduced all over the world, and they can be nuisance animals in certain parts of their range. I was reading about an endangered vole. Okay, I'm kind of a small mammal sympathizer, and this endangered vole in the United Kingdom was being threatened by introduced mink populations in the UK. So muskrats, fish, snakes, we're going to talk about muskrats in a little bit, frogs, turtles, these guys are extremely susceptible to PCBs because they eat larger fish. And so the fish that will grow and it can accumulate PCBs in their tissues, these guys then can have some developmental problems and reproductive problems because of PCB contamination. They are a fur bearer, just like the other, like the river otter that we just talked about. And when we get to weasels, I'm going to share another trappers report from the DNR, and I'll show you a little bit about mink when we look at that document. You guys know the habitat as well as I do: rivers and creeks and lakes, ponds, marshes. We do see quite a few mink around. I don't think that they're a rare critter in the state by any means, but a lot of the animals we're talking about today, with maybe the exception of beavers, they're pretty secretive. They're pretty solitary. They don't group up like we see with the otters. That they're unusual in that way. Let's see, I've got every time the chat, it turns orange, which is fabulous. They have been feasting on crayfish in our lake. Yeah, absolutely. And let's hope that they take out some of those non-native crayfish. That would be nice. Okay, so now we're into three different weasel species, and they are all managed together, which sometimes I struggle with this, because long-tailed weasels are different than ermine, or short-tailed weasel, and they're different than least weasels. So we have 3 species of weasels in Wisconsin, not including things like fishers and marten, and that are also in that same group, but weasels themselves. So this is the long-tailed weasel, and they eat a whole bunch of mice, voles, other rodents. All of the animals in the weasel family are voracious eaters. Okay, so if you look at this long cylindrical body shape, right, they have an extremely high metabolism because they lose a lot of heat to the surroundings. Because they're just skinny and long. that allows them to get into the places where they need to find mice and voles and that kind of business. But it makes it very challenging for them in our climate in the winter. So they have, their little motor is always going, and they have to hunt and consume food very, very, very regularly. So what you might, this is the species, those of you who have seen weasels out there, this is the species that is the most commonly found near buildings. They don't seem to be as worried or as affected by human presence. They do seem to, these are the ones you might see in your wood pile, okay? Really variable habitat, forested, brushy, open, farmland. They're kind of notorious for surplus killing. So if a weasel gets into, say, your chicken coop or something, it's and there's surplus kills where they're just killing and not eating everything. It's probably this little bugger that does it. They are very widespread, and they look very different depending upon where you are located. They're kind of found all throughout North America and down into Mexico. They have a lighter underneath and darker above, but they always will have this black tip to their tail. That is diagnostic for long-tailed weasels and ermine. But with a long-tailed weasel, their tail here is about as long as half of its body length from the tip of its nose to the base of the tail. So they are named long-tailed weasels, and they come by their name very honestly because their tail is longer than the other critters that we're going to talk about now. So here are some other long-tailed weasel varieties, if you will. They do change, you know, they do become white in the winter, but they still have that black tip. And in the Southwest, they can look like this. Those look pretty fancy, huh? You know, look at all this extra coloration on their faces. Wide variety in the way they look. You know, they can look all white, or they can look very, very brown. But then they also have different colors on their face. So this is a species here that is just near and dear to my heart, partly because this is the research project. Some of the pictures are a little gory, I will tell you, before we get into the research that we've conducted here. But I think it's important that I share with you kind of what we do here and how we really involve undergraduates in our research. So this is a northern critter. I mean, so think about something that's 6 ounces, and so we're talking, you know, an ounce is 28 grams. So I always tell my students that I weigh things in terms of deer mice, which makes me a little crazy. So, you know, 1 ounce is 28 grams, which is the size of 1 deer mouse. So now you're looking at, and some of these little things are only the size of 2 deer mice in size. They're just little, right? 2 or 3 deer mice in size. So in the case of the small ones. Very voracious eaters as well. They live all the way up in Alaska, and they have to fuel that metabolism. The males actually have a higher metabolism than females, which is what you wouldn't expect that. You would expect them to be a little bit more equal in their metabolic rate, and the animals that are bigger, the males are larger than females. But that's not what we see. Essentially, males will have a higher metabolic rate. It's just kind of interesting because they're larger bodied. You'd expect the smaller body critter to have a larger metabolic rate. They're a fur bearer. Again, really varied habitats. Wherever there's something to eat, you're going to find these guys, especially because they're constantly basically hunting. I don't know how much truth there is to this, but something I saw said that when the animals have their white coat, they're called ermine. When they're in their brown coat, they're called stoats. However, I have seen most of them called short-tailed weasels, and they're all the same thing. This is why I tell students, this is why it's very important to use scientific names when you're dealing with scientists, because I might say ermine and someone else might say a stoat, and we mean the same thing, but communication really isn't happening very, very well. So I'll share, I love this. I got some food to go. Where do you want to eat? Your place or mine? Ermine. They are, they can kill things that are bigger than them. You know, an ermine or a long-tailed weasel can take down a rabbit, no problem. They're cold-blooded killers, is what they are. So I'll talk to you just briefly about the research project that we conducted. This was several years ago. So since they're trapped legally in the state, we could get our hands on a fair number of carcasses. So 800, and this is the years we were doing this. So 800 trappers harvest almost 8,000 weasels. Well, they grouped them all together, long-tailed, short-tailed, and least weasels. But we don't really know much about parasites. So we were looking at two different parasites, and I'll just quickly kind of share with you. This is called Scrimbingulus nasicola. It's very hard to say. The weasels will acquire Scrimbingulus. In many cases, our ermine got them from eating shrews. They would eat a shrew that had already eaten a gastropod, and then the gastropod would transmit the parasite to the shrew, and then the weasels get it from eating shrews, and then they go into the nasal sinuses. The other parasite we were going to talk about is something called Phylloides martis, and it basically is a parasite that's in the lungs. And essentially, these intermediate hosts, the hosts where the parasite is molting into another stage, are often snails and slugs. Okay, and so I think that a weasel would eat the snail or slug, but most commonly the snail or slug is eaten by a small mammal, and then the small mammal is consumed by the weasel. One sex displays higher intensity or prevalence than the other. So in the case of males, being a male is a risky business when it comes to parasitism. Males have a higher parasite load because they have larger home ranges and because they come in contact with more individuals, but they also have a higher metabolic rate and they're eating more. So they're coming in contact and eating more of these hosts that are parasite laden. And males also have a higher testosterone level, and testosterone decreases the immune system. So it's just bad to be a male, right? So you've got all these problems, and increasing parasite loads is just one of them. So our students were looking at whether male ermine would have a higher intensity of these parasites than females. So we asked trappers to give us the carcasses, and I'll show you a picture of that. And then we had students dissect these little skinless things. And we were looking at whether the parasite loads were higher in males than females, okay? Here's one of those gory photos, but this is what it looked like when we would get them. I will tell you this, it's hard to tell a weasel to species without its fur on, okay? So there's so much overlap in body size between a weasel, an ermine, and a long-tailed weasel. So they had to actually measure the skull. So these are calipers, and they're measuring skulls to identify it. The other thing that many mammals have is what's called a baculum. It is a penis bone. And those bones differ by species. So this is the least weasel, this is the ermine, and this is the long-tailed weasel. So the bacula, which are intact in the carcass, our students were able to look at them to help to identify the carcass to species. And this is where those nasal worms are. So they're not right down in the nose. They're all the way up in the brain case here, which is pretty, at first we were looking here and we're like, man, none of these weasels have Scrimbingulus. Well, once we kind of got the right search image, they were very commonly found up here. The female worms are larger than the male worms. So did some stats, we're kind of geeky that way, to try to identify whether there was a difference in parasitism by sex. And essentially what we found was that Scrimbingulus were all over the place. 211 of 216 weasels had them, which is not what we expected. when we started looking at this, we were like, wow, they eat a lot of shrews, and that's very likely what we thought we would see, where they would get them. So there were very few that had no parasites, and a whole bunch that were parasitized. But you could have as many as almost 60 of these worms inside a particular weasel. You know, for somebody like me who likes gross stuff, that's great. The students were really excited about that, but it's really high parasitism. Do they do any pathology? Do they cause pathology? They absolutely can. In museum specimens, this is a parasite that's found in other mustelids, also in other weasels. But when they are, when these skulls have been submitted to like different places like the Smithsonian as an example, where they have skulls in collections, you can tell from the skulls who were infected with this parasite, because it actually changes the shape of the brain case. And certainly, yes, males were more affected. Males had more parasites than females, okay, which is what we expected. We also saw a difference in intensity by year. So in intensity is the number of parasites in a particular host. And in males and females, we still saw a difference over time. But there was no significant change over by year. If it went up in males, it went up in females in the same year, essentially. And we thought that that was very likely because of precipitation patterns. Males had higher intensities than females, also of that worm that's found in the lungs. Okay, but there were a whole bunch of those that were not infected. Okay, it was much more rare to have Phylloides martis. And then this is that precipitation, where we did see precipitation, a relationship between precipitation and the number of parasites that we found for both F. martis and S. nasicola. So they eat lots of shrews, hormones, body size, and metabolism, like I shared with you before. They have a polygynous mating structure. So let's say that this is a female home range and the blue is a male home range. So one male will breed with many females, and thereby having more opportunity to take up parasites from the shrews that are in a larger area, you know, so larger home ranges. Let's see what's going on the chat. How about external parasites like ticks? I wish we could have looked into that, but they were skinless, right? So we didn't have an opportunity, but we know that ticks are very common in Wisconsin on all sorts of critters, from, you know, weenie crops eat coyotes and foxes, and I've been studying a little bit of urban fox and coyotes down in Madison, and we do see them for sure. Yeah, we actually, Paul and I had this discussion. Anyone else eating lunch? We actually, that's why I warned you. I'm so sorry. Yeah, bad trajectory for climate change, and that really is a nice tie-in with the ticks. Moose get a disease called ghost moose disease that is in a preponderance of ticks on the carcass, and when we get the animals, they're usually dead, right? So with an increase in global climate temperature, we're going to see expansion of ticks for sure. Yeah, the impacts of these parasites, we tried to look at that with body condition, but it's really hard because these guys are just little, you know, they're really long and skinny regardless. We were trying to look at how do the parasites affect the body condition. So are the fatter weasels, do they have fewer parasites? We just couldn't get at that, partly because we've been having a really hard time getting a good metric for what fat is and what isn't. You know, it's really not a good idea to be a fat weasel, because they need to weasel into things, right, and weasel back out of them. Shorter lifespan. A lot of these weasels, they don't live for very long anyway. Maybe 2 years would be a long lifespan. What we were really interested in, and I don't know how to answer this question, is are the animals that are parasitized more likely to be trapped by the legal trappers and we're like, wow, like we don't have an answer to that because it's really hard. It's really, really hard to trap them live. And then we would have to kill them anyway, right? To look inside their brain cases. Any other critters with 2 front fangs outside of 4? Recently found a head. That's a good question, Beth Tweed, and I don't have an answer without being able to look at it. So if you want to send me a picture of the skull, I would be happy to try to identify it for you, because it really depends upon the size, you know, to put it into one category or another. Good questions. I'm always excited to talk about research with my undergrad kids, so this is great.
There was one other question earlier in the chat
that
had been missed. Is there an ecological need to kill otters?
Is there an ecological need to kill otters? I'm trying to think of why, when they would be, like, say in an over harvest. Are they over harvesting fish, or are they over harvest? Otters can be nuisance critters at aquaculture facilities for sure. Like you get a group of otters coming in, they'll wipe out a fish aquaculture facility or a hatchery, no problem. But that's a very small, situation, right? I don't know that they're ecologically detrimental. But I also don't think that harvesting them decreases the population to a degree where we need to worry about them in the state of Wisconsin. That's not the case in other parts of the United States. They're at lower levels than desired there. So I think that they're sustainably harvested in Wisconsin, and that's kind of the goal, is wise use, right? Management is wise use of the resource, and that's, I think, what the DNR is attempting to do there.
There are a couple more questions in there. I think for the sake of time, maybe continue with your presentation. And
okay.
I think we're going to have a lot more questions come in. So
let's
make sure you can finish your presentation, and then we'll take as many questions as we can at the end.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just quickly, say trappers are a terrific source of carcasses. These folks are harvesting them, and they want to do something with them. They want to submit them. And this is Matt. He's now a PhD student down at Texas, working on actually non-native deer. But he went on, so we published this. These are a bunch of undergrads, and now they are off doing great things. This is the smallest weasel we have, and by least weasel, it's like 1 deer mouse in size. It's like 28 grams. But it is the smallest carnivore, the smallest living carnivore. They do not have a black tip to their tail, and we need to know more about least weasels in the state of Wisconsin. They are by far the least trapped critter among the 3 weasel species that we've talked about. They are found in forests and fields and marshy areas. They eat shrews. They are just voracious little carnivores, all the way up in Alaska, again, non-hibernating. So if you think about what they must do to keep, to stay alive, they're capable of killing rabbits. So something the size of a mouse is capable of killing something the size of a rabbit. And I don't know about you guys, but I got some big old hoss rabbits in my backyard, big cottontails, because I have habitat back there, rabbitat, I guess we would call it. So fur bearer, just like the other 2, managed with them, eats 40% of its body weight each day. Okay, so again, fueling this metabolism. The fur is white in the winter in the northern range, but they don't have that black tip on their tail, which is one way for us to try to, when you see a picture of a weasel, it's like, oh, it's just a weasel, I don't know what it is. Well, if it doesn't have a black tip on its tail, it's probably a least weasel. And if it's really, really small, it's probably a least weasel. I think you all know about raccoons, right? They are hyper abundant in urban environments. They do great in cities. I had a former grad student who was studying urban raccoon diseases like parvovirus and distemper down in Madison and in Milwaukee, and we got a lot of samples from those parts of the state. There's more southern in their distribution. They don't occur all the way up in Alaska. And it's, you know, remarkable to me because you've got something the size, like that little least weasel occurs up in that really cold climate, and then a raccoon, which seems like it would be everywhere, you know, doesn't do so well. They eat anything. They are the true omnivore of the carnivore group. And they can be quite big. I mean, can you even imagine almost 50-pound raccoon? They are a nuisance in some cases, and certainly fur bearers. They are harvested for their pelts. They're not social, but they are a communal dinner. So I teach out at the Central Wisconsin Environmental Station over to the east of here. And there's one tree on a trail that we call the raccoon tree, because almost every year that I teach out there, you can knock on it or you listen, and there's like a big hollowed out part, and there's just like 2 or 3 raccoons in there. And they'll kind of pop their heads out sometimes when we're around. So see a lot of raccoons around. They do carry rabies, but I wouldn't necessarily vilify them for that. They are also have Balis ascaris procyonis. That's also raccoon roundworm. It is a parasite that when it gets into humans, especially young children, toddlers, it can be fatal. So they are cute though. Look at this, right? They have, you know, this little mask. They are prolific in cities, and in some cases, you know, in the Pacific, or I mean in the Atlantic seaboard, they do have problems with rabies. I did my undergrad in New York, and I was trapping raccoons as an undergrad, doing some research on Lyme disease, and I had to be rabies vaccinated in order to do that. Let's see what our chat says. What is the rate of rabies in raccoons? That's a good question. They do not have rabies here in the Midwest. It is moving towards us. The last I heard, it was kind of in the Ontario and Ohio, but what they're doing, and it's very rare, it's a very, very small percentage of the animals that have it. And what they're doing is they are taking vaccines and putting them into an oral like bait, and they are dumping them out of helicopters and airplanes to try to make a barrier. So in Ontario and on through, they're trying to vaccinate raccoons against rabies, and they're making it a really smelly bait. And then when the raccoons eat it, they end up getting vaccinated against rabies. So that's kind of one of the things that's gone lately. Yes, exactly. You know, trying to get as many of them vaccinated, and so we have a lower susceptible population, which is extremely relevant in the time of COVID-19. Possums, they get frostbite, so we don't see them very far north in some cases. And we have it's like we have hit or miss years. Like some years it's like, ooh, this is a great possum year, and all the rehab centers around, some of them in my neck of the woods up here, they end up getting a bunch of possums in. And then the next year, or for many years after that, we don't see them. I had one in my backyard here in Stevens Point 2 summers ago, and it was the biggest possum I've ever seen. They have 50 teeth, so when they open their mouth and they're drooling and looking about as unpleasant as they possibly can right before they play dead, they can look pretty menacing. That furless tail is very diagnostic. They don't occur in the north because they get frostbite. They have this prehensile tail. They play dead. If you go close, they'll fall over. They're non-protected, and they're managed as a fur bearer, if you can even imagine. I don't know anyone who hunts them or traps them for their fur, but they are in that fur bearer group, and it might be because they could be incidentally trapped on accident when you're trapping for something else. Their gestation is less than 2 weeks. So they're pregnant for a very short period of time, and then once those young are born, they have very well developed forelimb muscles, and so those babies climb out of the the birth canal essentially, and then they climb up to the pouch with these like burly, you know, forelimb muscles, and then they plunk down in that pouch, and then they stay there until they're much larger, and then the female will kind of carry them around on her back. They do eat a lot of ticks, because we guys have already talked about ticks. They're voracious tick eaters. So I always look at them as something positive when I see them. Except my dachshund, I've got this little dog, and he was like, this possum was bigger than him. It's crazy. Striped skunks. This critter is eaten by great horned owls, and that's about it. Because of this aposematic coloration here. This means business, right? This is, I've got something in store for you, this black and white warning coloration. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen one kind of walking around. It's like they look drunk. They're kind of like ambling here and there around. And it's partly because they don't need to get anywhere super quickly, because they're really, they're very well protected by this awful musk that they emit. I have been sprayed by a skunk once in my life. I do not recommend it at all. I had a terrible headache, my clothes, it was terrible. They will stomp their front feet and raise their tail. So I feel like they give you enough warning before they detonate their weapon, essentially. They'll eat all sorts of things, invertebrates, eggs, carrion. They'll eat small mammals, you know, lots of things. They're considered a fur bearer in some states. In Wisconsin, they are a fur bearer. But again, I don't know people who actually purposefully target them for their fur, even though they are, in my opinion, really quite beautiful. They are a carrier of rabies as well. Again, there is some trap, vaccinate, and release, TVRs, what we call those programs. These guys are more commonly rabies vectors out in the Western United States. So I did my graduate work, my master's and PhD at University of Wyoming, and that state had more striped skunk rabies and bat rabies. They didn't really have rabies, the other types of rabies like bats and raccoons or anything like that. Let's see here. Will they dig up moles in yards? Yes, they will. And they dig up a lot. They'll dig up, you know, sod that you've just put down specifically for insects. And I think that they would dig up moles. It would take quite a committed skunk to do that. Usually moles can be pretty deep in your yard, but I wouldn't put it past them at all. I think that it's certainly a possibility. Beavers and muskrats are the next two critters that we'll talk about, and I want to mention them because they're probably species that you guys see quite commonly. And there's nothing else nothing you can get mixed up with this, right? This big flat tail. They pound it on the water to communicate and as a warning sign for others. They're monogamous, which makes them, I think, pretty amazing. They build dams or lodges, and they are nature's engineers for sure. And they will, a male and a female will den together, and then they will have young. Those young will be born and stick around for a while and can actually help raise the next litter until they disperse. So they are found in monogamous pairs, which is unusual, particularly for rodents. They do occur all the way up into Alaska. In Wisconsin, many of you probably know this already, that management of beavers can be very controversial because they will dam up deep rivers or fast flowing cold streams, which are preferred trout habitat. So in parts of the northern portion of Wisconsin, the state game agencies and federal agencies are actually removing beaver dams and removing beavers because they are interfering with trout habitat. And this is, one of those kind of, is it good or bad? Is it trout versus beaver kind of situation? Well, you know, I'm not here to share my opinion on any of that. It's just really what you want to manage for. You just have, in some cases, these guys do create these these more wetland-like habitats by damming up streams and rivers. Bark, leaves, and twigs. We've necropsied a few of these. Necropsy is just an autopsy on animals. We've necropsied a few of these, and when we open them up, it's like their gut takes up, I'm not kidding, probably 2/3 of their body cavity. It's just because they have all of this really cool microbes that are in there that help them break down these diets that you would think they're very hard to digest, right? So the beavers can't do it on their own, so they need some microbes. Let's see, makes lodges and dams. Yep, monogamous. And then the last, I think it's the last one anyway, is muskrats. Again, they occur all the way up into Alaska and into the United States. I saw one of these maybe 5 years ago, and I live, in Stevens Point, of course, but it was on Division, and it was crossing Division right, kind of over by Patch Street, for those of you who are in the area. And I said, what in the world are you doing? It's probably going from some wetland, but it was going the absolute wrong way, and they don't seem to do very well on concrete. So naked scaly tail, dark brown beady eyes for sure. They eat a lot of roots of aquatic plants. So here will be like a nest chamber. There'll be snow, and so they're active year round. And then many of you who live on lakes where there's wetlands, you'll see these push-ups, right? So they will come out of their den or their nest, and before it gets really cold, they will start excavating these push-ups, and they need to do that in order to, when they're out foraging for these roots of aquatic plants and other things that they're foraging for underneath the surface of the water, they need to have a place to breathe. So they'll pop up into these push-ups, and which allows them to forage farther and farther away from their nest. But they look very orderly, right? They're a certain distance away because they know how far they can swim without taking a breath. So semi-aquatic, slow-moving streams. Let's see what's in the chat. Yes, I think they probably are bank beavers because they will make these little nest chambers or these little dens right along the bank of a lake, and you fall down into what looks like it would be stable. You could fall down into what was a former little nest for muskrats. So they'll eat mussels and crayfish. They are consumed by mink, also especially young muskrats that are at risk here if they're in the little nest chamber. Oops, this is varying here. I used a different slide for the template. This was for a snowshoe hare, so it's not relevant here. But some beavers do use banks, yes, but what I'm thinking of is when you're walking along on the outskirts of a lake and you fall down into into like a little hole, it's probably a muskrat den, because beavers will be a little bit farther down into the substrate, into the soil, and a lot of times they will excavate their own dens, their own lodges, right in the middle of an area, because they'll haul some of the young aspens and stuff out there. Frozen lakes, yeah. So it's really important for beavers and muskrats both, Garth, to have deep enough water so that they can be active year round. So when a lake freezes completely through, so that there's no water below that surface for surface ice, that is not ideal habitat for either muskrats or beavers. So the ideal habitat is, in the case of a beaver, is something that is deep enough to allow for only the top of the wetland or the lake or the what they've excavated to freeze, but they do need to have open water below that. Let's see. Oh, I've got foxes. That's right. So red foxes, very common. They're actually their largest geographic range of any canid and any carnivore in the world. I just put them in because I kind of assumed that you guys would see them around lakes. They'll eat anything, voles, rabbits, squirrels, carrion, and they have a diagnostic white tip to their tail and black socks. And then that is different. This is like a den that they have. And then gray fox. There's very few gray fox in comparison to red fox. So if you see a gray fox, I mean, for me, this is kind of a big deal. My daughter's school here in town, actually our children's school, my daughter goes to the same school as Paul's. They've been seeing a pair of gray foxes in their tiny little woodlot. And it just makes me smile because we just don't know the status of gray fox in the state. They're definitely not as common as red fox. They're also more southerly in their distribution, but they have semi-retractable claws and they can climb trees. And they're small, up to 15 pounds. Red fox are about the same size, but they have this kind of cinnamon color and black and white. I have again a lot of fondness for little gray foxes. Yeah, and they're found near water, so that's what I was thinking. Yeah, maybe we'll throw those in for the talk. So, all right, I handed it back off to you, Paul.
All right. Thank you, Shelli. We do have 2 other questions in the chat that we skipped from earlier.
Oh, good.
Dick's question and Beth, maybe specify the animal that you were talking about. I think that was the weasels, or maybe it was right after the weasels. But Dick Jenks had asked, other than man, what are the natural predators? And Beth asked
weasels?
if they den underground. So let's just wait a minute. Let's have them specify which critters they were referring to there. They can type that into the chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep track here now. Here I can start sharing or I can be back on video. Do gray fox and red fox compete when territories overlap? That's a good question, Janet. I kind of feel, and I don't have personal experience with this, the fox research that I've been doing is in Madison, and it's with urban and they do not really tolerate each other very well. Those of you who are around Madison and know Dr. Drake's work that he's been doing, the coyotes and foxes partition out their habitat very specifically in Madison. You see foxes in people's backyards. You see them in and among golf courses. You see coyotes in the Arboretum and Owen Park and Picnic Point, these areas that are much more urban green space. With gray foxes, there are so many fewer of them than there are red foxes that I'm just going to venture to guess here, Janet, that they don't have a lot of competition because there are a lot more red foxes than there are gray foxes. A friend of mine east of town has a pair of gray foxes in her yard, and she does not see red foxes out over that way. Neither species is particularly aggressive. They're much more secretive, but in terms of their tolerance for one another, I don't really know. I don't know how much overlap there would actually really be. They're just way more red fox around than there are gray fox, and we don't really know why that is. What we need is a graduate student to study gray foxes in the state, in my opinion. I'd be happy to do that. Predators of weasels. Hawks and other, raptor kinds of critters will take them out. There's some evidence of things like coyotes killing weasels. I know that in the case of like marten and fishers, which are big weasels, the fishers will kill marten. So I imagine that there might be an instance where you might see a long-tailed weasel kill a least weasel. But I don't know how common that would be. But mostly what I've found from the literature is that it's a lot of raptors and like things like coyotes.
Beth's question earlier was about weasels. So since we're at 1 o'clock, maybe a quick answer to that question: where weasels den?
Oh, they will they will either excavate a little, take an old mouse den or whatever under a down log, and they will, commandeer that. A lot of times, if they're going to go in there anyway and they're going to kill kill the mouse that's in there, they can modify that a little bit and use that. But they might have several areas, like in the case of a male weasel, they might have several areas around their home range that they will use on and off, as they're patrolling their home range. But a lot of times it's, these areas that were mouse dens or mouse nests.
All right, thank you very much again for your presentation today, Shelli. It's 1:01, so we'll call it here. I'll share one more reminder that next week's webinar is on Wednesday, the 29th at noon. If you have not registered for it yet, you can find the link in the latest edition of the Citizen Lake Monitoring Network newsletter. If you hold on just a minute, I'll throw it into the chat box as well. And thank you again, everyone, for joining today. We had about 55 people join the meeting.
Yay.
And I hope to see you again next week for the wetlands webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, the link to register for next week is in the chat if anybody would like to use that link.